How did I end up here? Lying in your arms, watching city lights turn to stars.
The classic saying of "don't judge a book by its cover" exists for a reason, right? It's not fair to write something off all because the cover is lackluster in its approach to catching your eye, when a lot of the time, its contents can be well worth your time. However, just because that's a general rule, and a good one at that, doesn't mean we can't just ignore the issue of a bad cover art after all. I mean, as stated, a cover art to something should catch your eye. It should pique your interest in order for you to read, watch, or play something. And it's the latter we're talking about today, video game box art. Well, I guess you could put that together already if you read the title, which you probably did, so I love digging holes for myself, huh? My poor ability to segue aside, video game box art, I'd say, is an often overlooked aspect of video games. Not exactly without talk surrounding the subject, but nor is it widely talked about either, so that's why I wanted to bring attention to it today. So, sit back, relax, maybe grab some hot chocolate because tea and coffee suck, I'm not sorry, as we dive into the art of video game cover art. I feel like it should start with a disclaimer that these are all my opinions and mine alone. I need to say that because, like a lot of things, art is subjective, so just because I say one piece of video game box art is good or bad, doesn't mean it is in an objective sense, you know? Great, so now that's out of the way, let's talk about why the original Final Fantasy VII box art is particularly bad. Ah, got you there, didn't I? Specifically, I mean the European cover art and not the North American vein. As for the North American cover art for Final Fantasy VII, illustrated by Yoshitaka Amano, a frequent illustrator for the Final Fantasy series, it depicts Cloud looking up at Shinra HQ, and despite it being arguably simple in a sense, nowadays it's quite an iconic piece of box art and the scene was even reused for a remake over 23 years later. It really speaks to its quality. And as for the Europeans released box art, it's not great. It follows the tradition for the series in redesigning the logo for each game to reflect the major aspect of the game, and in FF7's case, a meteor, which is also shown on the NA version. And that's it. All there is apart from the logo illustrations is a white background, which really isn't as exciting as seeing as a full illustrated piece of art on the front cover that catches your eye immediately. Of course, that's not to say there aren't people who like this box art, because I'm sure there is. This is, again, a heavily subjective video, but hey, at least both North America and Europe got the same box art for a remake, so there's that at least. Next up, we kind of have a reverse of the roles here, where the European box art outshines the North American box, and I'm of course talking about the original Silent Hill. See, with the European box art, it's eerie looking. It makes you ask questions as to what's going on because of how unclear everything is. It's great, even if it has aged in an uncanny valley kind of way, perfectly capturing the spirit of Silent Hill, to be fair. So, how does the NA version compare? Your guess is as good as mine for what's going on here, because man, I really don't know what's trying to be conveyed here. I mean, to some extent, it's creepy in a way that I can't quite describe, but more so in an unsettling way. Just not the way I'm sure they wanted to convey. They kind of just grayscaled the hell out of it, you know? Unrelated, but also on topic, should Konami ever pull their heads out of their asses and actually do something with their back catalogue of games again? Silent Hill specifically, I think they should remake Silent Hill, so we can have a chance of seeing an updated, better looking version of one's cover art for the remake. Sounds ideal to me, I don't know about you. If you've never heard of Ico before, then let me briefly explain. Ico was first released on the PlayStation 2 in 2001, being made by Team Ico, whose name you might recognise as the ones behind Shadow of the Colossus. Simply put, Ico is an action-adventure game directed by Fumito Ueda, who wanted to create a minimalist game around the simple boy-meets-girl concept. The brief summary aside, Ico's European and Japanese box art is generally really pleasant to look at, having this beautiful illustration that's both simple in its approach, but also gives off this sense of adventure, making you want to play the game and explore the vast land, as depicted on the cover. Now, as for... I really don't need to say anything, just here it is. So yeah, this exists. Okay, so it's not horrendously bad or anything, but it doesn't even compare to the other variant. It suffers from the same problem that Silent Hill's box art does, in that, well, you've got questionable CG on the cover. Now, sure, I already mentioned Silent Hill's NA cover's art has aged, not really for the betting, but even so, it's such a betrayal for NA to be left with this version of the cover and not the other one. But hey, at least the windmill is present in both, so there's something. And finally, for a more recent example, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, but in this case, while the version I'm bothered about I don't actually consider bad, it is rather disparaging in a sense. To begin with, of course, the good one, the NA variant. Simply put, this one is just gorgeous. Beautifully illustrated by Takumi Wada, it depicts Link overlooking the land of Hyrule, directly at Hyrule Castle, which Calamity Ganon has claimed as his own, really conveying that the idea of a grand and epic adventure that you're about to embark on across the immense land of Hyrule. Okay, fine, the European variant isn't bad, as I previously stated, because I do still like it, but when compared to the NA variant, yeah, there's just no competition really. Again, the European version is far from being even close to bad, but like, we Europeans were robbed, man. I believe Kidicus put it best when he said,
This looks like you caught Link in the middle of him weeing off the edge of a cliff.
Moving on from regional cover art differences, I want to share my opinions and feelings on some miscellaneous examples of good and bad cover art pieces. To start with, I'm going to go over some examples of cover art that I think are good, and then finish off with examples that I like and or love. To begin with, let's talk about Cyberpunk 2077. Now, Cyberpunk 2077 is a game many people feel strongly about, and not necessarily in a good way, but pushing that to one side for now, think back to the previous CD Projekt Red titles, such as The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. Its cover art catches your eye, with Geralt of Rivia being front and centre. It's arguably a little too simple in places with its plain white background, but to contradict my feelings from earlier on Final Fantasy VII's European box art, I think the simplicity works here because it makes Geralt stand out that much more. Now, there is a Game of the Year variant of the cover art with an ugly banner across the top and accolades scattered, but we'll get to that when we get to that. It's also going to sound like I'm contradicting myself again here when I say that I don't particularly like Cyberpunk's box art, especially when it follows a similar design approach to The Witcher 3's, but I think I can explain my way out of this one. See, on the cover, the protagonist, V, is front and centre again, but here's the thing, if you were to know nothing about the game, then V just looks like your generic shooter/action protagonist. Sure, female V stands out slightly more, which is why I used that version of the cover, but even still, it's still surprisingly bland. To be honest though, if V wasn't going to catch your eye, which I'm pretty sure the designer knew going in, they compensated by making the background a garish yellow, which is damn sure to catch your eye, but obviously not in a good way. It's kind of ugly in my opinion, not to mention they also coloured the spine in the box yellow, which drives my OCD insane seeing it on a shelf like that, but nevertheless. Just imagine if they chose to have V standing in front of a backdrop of Night City, or hell, what if they chose to use one of the pieces of promotional art inside the film? Wouldn't that be so much cooler? It's really something when you have strong feelings about a game's cover art, but nothing much to say about the game yet. My weirdly impassioned rant about a yellow box aside, another piece of cover art I find myself disappointed in is Pokemon Sword and Shields. Why do they like this? Compare these to previous Pokemon entries, which is something I'm sure you're tired of hearing by now, whether you like the games or not, but anyway, take Platinum's box art, for example. It's nice, it catches your eye, it's shiny, so bonus points for pleasing my monkey brain, and you look at Pokemon Sword and Shields, which, yeah, sure, they still have the legendaries on the front, a trend that's been going on since Pokemon Gold and Silver, but that's kind of it really, there's nothing else to them. Even the games before Sword and Shield, Let's Go Eevee and Pikachu, had more appealing cover art, and that's really saying something, seeing as they were just rendered against a field background. I mean, they could have used screencaps from the Sword and Shield trailer where they revealed the mascot legendaries for the cover art. I think that would have been infinitely better than what we got. They're uninspired and bland, is what I'm trying to say, something which I'm sure a lot of people also feel about the games themselves, but to hell with me if I'm going to touch that hornet's nest again. I mentioned a few moments ago in the Cyberpunk segment how The Witcher 3 had a variant of its box art with a more cluttered design. Well, if you think that one was a mess, then just take a look at the cover art for the Game of the Year edition for Batman Arkham City. Yikes, talk about overbearing. There's just too much going on here, it's a cluttered mess. I'm obviously not the first one to talk about how bad of a piece of cover art this is, but nonetheless, that still doesn't excuse how anyone thought this was okay. Where's the point of focus here exactly? accolades scattered left and right, an ugly Game of the Year banner underneath the console banner, the big 10 out of 10 plastered below that. This is just a nightmare in terms of graphic design. Well, hey, at least there's no chance of mistaking the game for being bad, I suppose. Going back to the horror genre of video games here briefly, Amnesia: The Dark Descent. Yep, even a game as famous and arguably iconic as Amnesia isn't free from god-awful cover art. They really just gave an employee a piece of artwork and just told him to go ham on the blur effect, which, to their credit, they sure did. Honestly, this looks more like a meme than anything, and it really takes away from how terrifying the creature in the back, a gatherer, really is in game. And hey, Daniel in front here looks like he's high off his ass, so you know what, never mind, I guess this cover art's perfect then, because of how it perfectly captures what I imagine that feels like. Finally, for the final piece of bad video game cover art, Snow White and 7 Clever Boys. Enough said. Whew! I'm tired of talking about bad video game cover art, so let's move on to ones that I, personally, really like or even love. To begin with, as a Xenoblade fan, I'd be committing some kind of sin if I didn't mention how great the original Xenoblade Chronicles cover art is. Depicted, we see the Monado in a grassy field, surrounded by some broken bits of mech on armor, and in the background, we see the Mechonis overlooking it all. Where this cover art is based, I believe to be on the Neo the Bionis, and it's so good, it really is. No matter my true feelings towards the original Xenoblade Chronicles, I adore this box art for what it is. It's the perfect teaser for the grand adventure you're about to set up on. Vague enough to not give too much away, but presenting you with enough fine details to really get you excited. It's amazing. Safe to say we start out on a really strong note, and I can take this with Xenoblade Chronicles 2. Yes, I'm biased for this game, it's my favourite after all, but even I'll admit that its cover art isn't as good as the originals, but I still think it's amazing in its own right. I realise I'd pretty much be repeating most of what I said for the originals box art, so I'll leave you with that note. But personally, this cover art is beautiful, and it's one of the many things that constantly reminds me why I love Xenoblade Chronicles 2 so much. To follow up from a JRPG that I adore so much, a JRPG that I really haven't sunk a lot of time into, but only because it lost my interest. Dragon Quest XI. Now, that's not to say the game is bad at all, it's just not for me personally. Combat feels a little uninvolved, the characters don't intrigue me, etc. But those are talking points for another day maybe. As for now, we're primarily talking about its cover art, which I think is astounding honestly. DQ11's cover art I can understand being highly subjective given its art style, but it's that art style that makes me really like it. It's just really pretty. And I think anyone who loves RPGs or JRPGs will agree with me when I say it really captures that certain nostalgia for old RPGs, of which DQ11 prides itself on in a way. I may not sound like I know what I'm talking about with this, but the bottom line here is that I think DQ11's cover art is great. I don't have too much to say about this one, and that's regarding Sea of Thieves. Disregarding my feelings for the game itself, I just really like this one. And sure, there is quite a bit of dead space present, which is admittedly something that does bother me, but then you look to the center in the skull and it just looks really nice. It's beautifully made, and given it's literally the center focus of the cover art, it is likely to catch your eye. Lastly, we have somewhat of a hidden gem we're talking about here, in Kid Icarus Uprising for the Nintendo 3DS. Someday I would really love to talk about this game in greater detail, but unfortunately today is not that day. And we have something else to talk about. Instead, it's cover art. Duh. Uprising's cover art is wonderful, truly. It looks so good. And keep in mind, this was the first new Kid Icarus game in 21 years at this point. So seeing Pit all happy and ready to go on the cover really gets across that this was the return of Kid Icarus. A somewhat long awaited one at that, and I personally feel the art really captures that feeling, both for us and the character, in a way. Whether you were familiar with Kid Icarus beforehand, which I'm sure a lot of people came to be following his inclusion as a playable character in Super Smash Bros. Brawl, or not, I think this cover art is likely to catch your eye, whether that be for the art alone or the feeling I just went over. Cover art is important in catching a potential buyer's attention, and depending on the box art, it could determine whether that person buys it or not, or could even determine someone's overall opinion on the game, even if just in the slightest way, and I hope I've made that message clear here today. I think there's an art to video game box art, pun intended, yes. I think it needs more attention sometimes, and more credit than we often give it. So if there's one thing you're going to take away from today's video, then it should be, good box art is good and bad box art is bad? Yeah, let's go with that.